chairperson of the regulator and a member of this subcommittee, Ms. Mbungose, and the second person, Angas Tole, the CEO of NASA, who's also a member of this committee. Thank you. I just waiting for Advocate Tole to show her face, and then we can continue.
Chair, I think my camera has moved.
Okay.
I will do that at an appropriate
in due
time.
course. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this hearing was duly advertised on the business day, the Pretoria News, the Build, Media 24, and on the NASA website, and it's held in accordance with the National Energy Regulator Act, in which all affected parties are given an opportunity to present their relevant facts and evidence to the energy regulator. The hearing is governed by the following rules. All parties will be required to make their presentations under oath, obviously with the exception of your senior counsel and other members who do not have to do that. In this case, we have one presenter, and that presenter is Sasol. They've requested to present for 50 minutes, and they have been allocated 50 minutes. Only members of the panel are allowed to ask questions to the presenters. But however, if there are members of the public that would want questions asked, they can do that by sending an email to Mr. walter.mabunda@nasa.org.za, and the panel will then decide on how we deal with that. Should the presenters wish to consider certain information confidential, we would then request that the room be cleared, where we would be able to deal with the confidential information in that. The recording of this hearing, which is done through the microphone, so all of the presenters, I'll request them to put their mics on, would be the official record of this hearing. May I request that those who would not be presenting or talking, if they could switch off their mics, and all of those that have cell phones when they're presenting, if they could switch them off as well. Our request for presentation was received from Mr. J.P. Menkis, Huisiame Khole, and Paul Anderson from Sasol Gas. May I check if we have those people in the room?
Good morning, Mr. Mukula. It's J.P. Menkis speaking. I hope you can hear me clearly.
Yes, Mr. Menkis, you are very clear. Are you going to do the oath, or should we get the other members all in one?
Right. Mr. Chairman, my proposal would be as follows. The presentation that we plan to make, there will be 4 presenters that will be participating in the presentation. It will be myself and Mr. Rudy Hieterman, who is employed by Sasol, and then we've got Mr. Paul Anderson, and we've got Mr. Anthony Fellet, who's employed by a consultant, Genesis Analytics, and they are participating in the presentation as expert advisors. In that regard, we would propose that the oath be taken by myself and Mr. Easterman as part of the presentation. And when I do the introduction, I'll indicate which parts of the presentation will be dealt with by the 4 speakers.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Menkis. Then let's start with you. May you please raise your right hand and affirm, do you solemnly declare that the evidence you are going to give to this panel is the truth and the whole truth?
I confirm.
Thank you. You may then start with your presentation, Mr. Menkis.
Right. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity that we are afforded to make this submission. And obviously this oral submission that we are making today is augmenting the written submission that we made previously as part of the public participation process. We did send through the presentation earlier. I don't know, is the intention that the presentation will be shared from NERSA's side, or do we need to share it from our side, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Mabunda, can you provide guidance there?
Chair, I missed that part. May you repeat?
Mr. Menkes wants to know if they must beam the presentation from their side or you will be beaming it.
It is much easier, Chair, if they beam it from their side so that they control it the way they want.
Mr. Menkes, would that be acceptable to you?
But we can assess if there's challenges from their side.
No, that's in order. Just give me a second to get it open and to share it into the meeting.
I can see it on my screen, Mr. Menkes. So it's
there we go.
Thank you.
Right. Right, Mr. Mabunde, we can then move to the next slide. And on this slide, I'm just indicating that the presentation that we'll be making this morning basically falls out in 5 parts. I'll do a short introduction, and then we will go to a technical evaluation on the cost plus methodology using the WACC pass-through as well as the margin methodology. The first one will be dealt with by Mr. Paul Anderson, and the second one then, as I indicated, Mr. Anthony Fillett. And then Mr. Yeasterman will make a few comments about the proposed methodology relating to LNG importers, and then I will conclude the presentation with a short summary. So if you can move to the next slide, please. The consideration of an appropriate methodology to determine the maximum gas prices for the South African market, which NASA is tasked with, has to be viewed within the context of the objectives of the Gas Act and the specific mandate that is provided to NASA in the legislation with regards to price regulation. Now, as we all know, in terms of Section 21(1)(p) of the Gas Act, the price regulation that NASA is tasked with takes place in a scenario of inadequate competition. And therefore, NASA has to compensate for that inadequate competition by ultimately regulating the prices in the market by mimicking what the outcome or what prices would have been in competitive gas markets. And that's the fundamental mandate of NASA when it comes to price regulation. Two of the key objectives of the Gas Act that NASA has to also take into account in the context of the price regulation is the objective to promote access to gas in an affordable manner, as well as the promotion of the development and growth of a competitive gas market. And in achieving both those goals, NASA has to weigh up and balance the interests of the supplier into the market as consumers and the customers who are operating in that market. Now, we respectfully submit that the approach that NASA and ensuring that security of supply into the market is achieved. The first way in which it is hampered is the fact that instead of providing regulatory certainty in the market, the fact that NASA has scarcely within 18 months after adopting the 2020 maximum price strategy have seen fit to propose a total jettison of the existing methodology and adopting a total different approach, apart from the fact that the proposed approach is unsuitable, as will become clear as part of the remainder of the presentation. The fact that NASA takes this course of regulatory certainty within the market, but contributes to turbulence and uncertainty. The Constitutional Court, in its decision of July 2019, did not criticize or found that the previous methodology of the basket of alternatives in its essence was problematic. The finding of the court for the monopolist supplier in the market, that was overturned the decision that was taken. Notwithstanding that basis of the Constitutional Court, NERSA then saw fit to basically jettison the previous methodology. As far as we understand and interpret the existing methodology, the existing adequate measures, together with the discretion that the Gas Act provides to NERSA in managing the gas prices in the market to deal with the current market situation. And then the second count, the fact that the price framework set by the regulator is a key consideration for new entrants to the market. South Africa is currently facing growth of the South African industry. In this context, South Africa is a competitor to compete for the supply of gas in an international market. Loses sight of the fact that the price framework in this regard is also the fact that African market does have a direct bearing on the viability of the fact. From a historical point of view, the regulation that NERSA did impose in the market to the affordable access to gas in the market regulated the price at a considerable lower level than market took place to natural gas in 2004. Regulation and price regulation on the special regulatory dispensation methodology and also under the 2020 methodology and the current price and do not represent or mimic competitive price. The future supply and the security of supply into the market will be adversely affected. And then if we can move to the next slide, please. As I indicated, I think we have full understanding and recognition for the fact that national circumstances and the current international market circumstances as a result in 2020 provides adequate mechanisms through the rationality test as well as the statutory discretion that NERSA has in the regulation of price pursuant to the authority that it has in terms of both the NERSA Act and the Gas Act to deal with. In summary, therefore, our view remains that it is premature and counterproductive in the interest of regulatory certainty to jettison the existing methodology and replace it with an inappropriate cost-plus methodology. That such an approach would obviously mimic international and competitive gas markets, and therefore that NERSA holds in terms of its cost-plus approach. Using WACC is an untenable and counterproductive approach, and correctly it can form a valuable element in the rationality test, current methodology of determining maximum gas prices. I will now hand to Mr. Paul Anderson to deal with the first part of the proposed methodology.
May I administer the oath in you? May you please raise your right hand and affirm, do you solemnly declare the whole truth?
I do.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. You may continue.
Great. Thank you very much. Morning to everyone. As I've just been informed, my name is Paul Anderson. I'm one of the partners at Genesis Analytics. And in this part of the presentation, I'm really going to be focusing on one question and one issue. And that's really a traditional traditional methodology, because I think it is this type of cost plus WACC approach is something that's not new to regulators or to practitioners in this space. And it is something that is quite regularly used, but where it's used is normally in terms of kind of the regulation, particularly of infrastructure services. On the one hand, you've got infrastructure services, which are costs are predictable and identifiable. In the contrast, what we have with gas is a global, inexhaustible or finite natural resource whose value, it's volatile, and it's shaped strongly by users' perceptions of supply and demand at any point in time. The economic costs underlying the extraction and the production of this commodity are also hard to identify and heterogeneous within a given gas field. And And I think the bottom line is that if the mandate here is to, if we look at gas markets and how gas markets, even the experiences, where attempts to apply this cost-based regulation have been suggested by the sector. For example, literature's recognized that of the US, much of the inadequate investment into gas production experienced, between the decades 1960 and 1980, were in large part caused by inherent failures of an attempted cost-based regulation that was used in that sector. And maybe just to cost plus WACC approach. And I'm going to move through these quite quickly because a lot of the detail is in, I think, Sasol's submission. But I think the first point to note is something that I've already indicated, and really that gas prices, they're cyclical. They're by perceptions of supply, demand, and scarcity, and for it to be volatile. So it's certainly, and it's also true for other natural resources, so agricultural products as well as in mind, and this type of traditional cost plus WACC methodology just doesn't cut it. In terms of features for gas, is that gas supply is characterized by heterogeneous costs and differential returns. Gas itself is a natural resource that's extracted from the ground, and because of this, the risk, the uncertainty associated with the differential costs of supply, but you also have differential returns. Two different referred to as Ricardian rents, and again, it's something that's certainly true of gas markets, but it's also, and literature here indicates that that there should be that's needed to be able to sell this above extraction costs. And I think, without going to the detail of this here for time, type of scarcity premium, whilst recognized in theory, is also recognized to be impossible to calculate and for the quantum to be identified. But I think that just really lines, part of the reason why this makes, the traditional cost-based regulation so hard to gas, because it's very hard to account for this if you wanted to apply this type of regulating along this value chain. And I think further than that, it's also there are a lot of intangibles that are involved in the production and in the trading of this good. And I think this is something that my colleague answering in more detail shortly, particularly in relation to trading activities. And then lastly, what I would like to highlight as well is that the presence of opportunity. I think when we talk about opportunity costs here, in this specific instance, we can almost think of that as the value to a gas supplier of doing something different with the gas as opposed to selling it into an external market. Opportunity cost is from a company's point of view, it's a real economic cost, because just as for a normal kind of production cost, we would never want to regulate a price below production cost. And the reason for it mean the firm would be losing money when they were supplying the market, at least in the long run. And similarly, I think for these types of opportunity costs, the same holds, in that if prices are regulated at all below opportunity cost, actually a firm would be better off doing something else with the gas, and the incentive to supply. Opportunity cost from exports. I just want to take a moment and underline something that a point that Mr. Mankey's made up front, because I think it's important, and I want to just slow down because I think the truth of the matter is that South Africa is a long-term importer of gas and have domestic supplies of gas, and for the foreseeable future gas. And I think it would be naive to think in this manner. And I think this is particularly pertinent, I think, in the current energy crisis that we're facing, where the world is no doubt gas hungry, and the world is seeking out new sources of gas and willing to pay a premium for this gas, particularly non-Russian gas. And for us to think that we can have and effectively limit the foreign suppliers who are wanting to supply into South Africa, we limit their price to some form of extraction cost plus WACC, or something along those lines. I think it's just simply not viable. I think in honesty as well, in fairness, the Pandey Temane gas fields, they may be sources of supply that are currently committed to South Africa. So when I say committed, I think committed by, sunk investments that they've made. And for them and for the current supply of gas, these type of export options may not be that obvious or possible right now. But I don't think that kind of any precedent for this approach would dampen any further investment, or someone considering investment or expansions in gas in South Africa could be treated either then or at some time in the future. The concept that we've raised, they're well covered in economic, the regulator recent body of work, certainly that we found quite helpful in unpacking this. And this is a recent work done by the Florence School of Regulation. And maybe there's a few reasons why I like to single this out. And I think it was published last year, if I'm not mistaken. But I think the other reason is that this research is the price of gas molecules. And it's comprehensive in that it covers both around, why cost-based regulation is actually difficult, as well as detailed case studies and experiences. Okay, and I think I'm just going to put those up. I'm just going to read this. But the first is that one kind of conclusion that came out of this was the value of natural gas requires a treatment different from the cost of infrastructure developed for its production and commercialization. The valuation of natural gas, and hence its depreciation, is inherently unstable and only partly related to costs, and often limited to the long run. A cost-based price would only consider a part of the value of gas. And maybe to the next one as well, you can read the rest of that quote. The US they refer to the US in the 90s, 60s and 70s. And so the US and other countries' more recent experience show that these difficulties are far from purely theoretical. It can result in market distortions, shortages, and inadequate industry development. The best solutions seem to rely on them of cost-based estimation regarding the price of produced or imported gas, which is taken instead from liquid and sufficiently competitive market hub. And I would respectfully kind of suggest to NERSA that actually this, and to look at this and to investigate this resource holistically, and not just statistically. Their conclusion is that it right market valuation of these gas prices. And I think what that does is it leads quite neatly to my dealing, particularly of incorporating benchmarks from comparator margins into the methodology. So I'm going to just hand over to Anthony now.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. Mr. Feld, before you state your name and your position at Genesis and your relationship with...
I'm a partner at Genesis Analytics, and we are a client of Sasol. Margin approach, the economic rationale specifically, and also we make some observations regarding the discussion document itself. Now, we want to say up front that in summary, we believe that the market approach, if applied correctly, and I'll get to specific points about the application, it can be appropriate for regulating gas prices. And as Paul stated, the application of the cost plus regulation in the gas industry has been largely discredited by potential effects of this type of regulation. For upstream activities, and these activities are not licensed, by the way, but for upstream activities, the marginal cost for gas are uncertain. And for trading activities, these are characterized by real economic risks that are often quite difficult to quantify in RAND terms. So what regulatory tools are available to NERSA to set? The obvious method that we've proposed in the past is to benchmark prices to the prices of competitive hubs, which is NERSA's current methodology. So we still hold the view that this is the optimum approach to regulating gas prices. But an alternative approach, which is essentially what NERSA is proposing, is to calculate a benchmark approach. And do we find evidence of it being applied by other economic on the assessment of abusive conduct? We see that it states that in certain circumstances, it is necessary to adopt a comparative benchmark approach instead of the traditional cost plus WACC approach. Specifically in circumstances when assessing pricing conduct for firms that are not trading companies, those companies that derive value from prior expenditure in customer acquisition, the development of supplier relationships. So these are type of the activities that we see in gas trading, in the gas trading environment, and the type of activities that Sasol Gas has been undertaking over many years. And I've listed the quote there from the guidance, which talks specifically to these type of circumstances. Secondly, by applying the margin benchmarking approach, where it compared the EBITDA margin seen as a reasonable proxy for the profit margin derived under competitive conditions. Now, the Commission importantly also looked at additional cost plus WACC approach for assessing aspirin's prices. Now, it found that capital employed for individual products and services, particularly for intangible assets, because this is records. And so it concluded that the adopting the cost plus WACC approach for determining the reasonableness of aspirin's prices would be a rather complex undertaking, and it deemed it to be not a feasible approach to assessing the reasonableness of prices. The South African competition authorities also consider the margin benchmarking approach for assessing the reasonableness of prices under Section 8.3c of the competition. Specifically states that the determination of whether a price is excessive can include comparing the profits of a respondent firm to those of comparative firms in competitive markets. So if we go to the next slide, what is the economic rationale of this approach for the purposes of regulating gas prices? Well, if capital costs are difficult to quantify for individual products, action industries, and if the WACC does not provide a reasonable proxy for the ex-ante risks, then other competitive benchmarks other than the WACC are required. Now, if we assume that gross margins are roughly does not rely on the calculation of capital employed for individual products. Now, we note that NERSA is proposing the use of gross margins in its methodology. Now, importantly, gross margins are required to cover all both tangible and intangible. Now, importantly, when we observe gas traders' profitability, we observe that their gross margins are often in excess of 50%, consistent over time. And this provides us with reassurance that there is a consistent economic model that is being observed across comparative companies, similar to the model adopted by Sasol Gas, which provides support benchmark approach for regulating Sasol Gas's prices. So what value do you get in exchange for this margin? Well, in the case of Sasol Gas, the counterparty risk when acquiring bulk reserves from foreign jurisdictions. It has that they have flexibility with regards to the level of volumes consumed month on month, which is not normally provided by upstream suppliers. It has capacity availability, similar to capacity availability that Sasol Gas has developed over many, many years. And this is particularly important for customers that have significant sums in their own processes and are wholly reliant on such security and have limited scope for switching to alternative sources of energy. And there's also the material working capital costs that Sasol Gas incurs to provide terms to its customers. So we go to the next slide and we talk to the specific observations. And we first start with the starting point of this methodology, the acquisition price. Now, although it is an acquisition price negotiated between two related entities, there is no economic reason to think that the acquisition price is overstated relative to the true arm's length value. It is important. Sasol has repeatedly stated in its submissions, the acquisition price was borne out from specific and unique historical arrangements, which did entail a series of vertically integrated investments along the whole value, which was required to make the whole gap and activities. Therefore, NERSA needs to focus on pure gas trading and distribution companies for the selection of margins that compared to those that are. Now, we agree that the consultation document. And in terms of other observations, we wish to make the point, the consultation document does contain an inconsistent method for determining the maximum gas price. In one part of the paragraph 4.21, it talks to the result. Also, the calculated markups in the consultation documents appear to be applied as a gross margin in an illustrative example on page 38 of the document. As NERSA is well aware, these margins are different, but albeit related metrics. And lastly, the application of the rationality test in relation to is unclear. Uses as a calculation for the pricing floor. But, however, the WACC is typically applied against capital employed. It's not used against the cost of sales and would therefore be insufficient to cover the operating and capital costs for gas traders. So just to summarize, I want to reiterate the view that the margin benchmark approach, if applied correctly, can be appropriate for regulating maximum gas prices. I'll pass on that to Rudy, who will discuss LNG.
Thank you, Mr. Veld. Mr. Histerman, before you start, may I just request you to raise your right hand and affirm, do you solemnly declare that the evidence you are going to give to this panel is the truth and the whole truth?
I do.
Thank you. For the record, may you please state your name, position at Genesis, and your relationship with Sasol?
Chair, my name is Rudy Histerman. I'm employed by Sasol. I am in the policy and regulation unit with specific responsibilities for economic regulation.
Thank you, Mr. Histerman. You may go ahead with your presentation.
Thank you. If we could have the next slide. Chair, I think it is very clear at this point that the next source for South Africa, source of gas for South Africa, has to be LNG. There are no pipe gas sources that are sufficiently developed to replace the depleting resources that currently come to South Africa, and in the same breath to meet the latent demand for gas that South Africa has. The methodology NERSA proposes takes a spot price in Asia, and it wants to apply that as a maximum price. It doesn't, without having any regard for transportation costs. And it also proposes to do so on a 12-month forward-looking basis. We find, that approach problematic in the current circumstances. The entire global LNG market is currently in turmoil. There's a race on to replace Russian gas with other gas sources, and that's predominantly LNG. So the trade in LNG has changed dramatically. On top of that, most LNG contracts, probably in excess, particularly liquefaction, but also it appears that in times when there is a reasonable amount of gas around, those prices tend to be below the equivalent energy value of crude oil. And in times as we have now, where there's a scarcity of gas, these prices can actually be multiples of the alternate energy value as reflected in crude oil prices. So our recommendation really is that that NERSA has a cautious approach at this point, because it's very difficult to determine what the future cost of LNG is going to be. The forward-looking 12-month period is an interesting concept. However, we are not aware of such a benchmark price and how it would be available. There certainly are forward curves for LNG, but forward curves, we have to point out, change on a daily basis. So it would be very difficult to determine how that forward curve would be determined. I think LNG contracts, just to add to what we've said before, are very dynamic, and they reflect changes in underlying markets on an ongoing basis. So they are typically have a base, and that base very often is crude oil, and it is then based on crude oil prices that were observed reasonably recently over short periods. Which means that there is always volatility in these prices, and one cannot regulate that volatility away by averaging out the costs that traders pay for this gas. So in any kind of gas pricing, and that holds for pipe gas and for LNG. I think the underlying changes in prices in the market must reflect frequently through frequent adjustments in the South African market, because one needs to protect both and enable the survival of both the LNG trader and consumer. When considering the importance of creating an environment, as Mr. Maintjes spoke about earlier, Africa, we believe that NERSA should implement a cost pass-through approach for LNG imports, and this should be fairly regularly reviewed, but it also should take account acquiring LNG by the importer. It must carefully look at the conditions associated with the contractual conditions associated with LNG molecules, because these are very often onerous and have take-or-pay requirements. They've got very onerous payment terms, and the downstream market from the trader may not always be able to provide the certainty of offtake that is required to ensure that that LNG cost that is used should be the forecast trading cost of the importer, and the application of benchmark margins could be very useful in this area to enable LNG to cover the costs and the risk as highlighted by Anthony in the previous presentation. So the underlying message from our point of view is that NERSA should really look at individual applications by LNG importers, take those into account, and then make an informed decision in terms of what maximum prices should be, rather than make a spot price, which certainly is developing internationally, but is not the predominant way in which LNG is traded, and therefore of LNG into South Africa on a long-term basis. Thank you, Chair. I'll hand over to Mr. Maintjes to conclude.
So thank you, Rudy. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think just in conclusion, then I think from Sasol as the supplier side, we recognize and we understand that the current macroeconomic drivers that exist in the international gas market has created high levels of volatility and has pushed international gas prices up. We also know that regulators around the world is grappling with how to respond to these developments. However, that does not mean and does not provide justification for the abandonment of the 2020 NERSA maximum gas price methodology, the international benchmark methodology, which result in maximum prices mimicking competitive markets. As we've stated in previous presentations to NERSA, as well as the submissions that we've made to NERSA, it is Sasol's view that the current methodology, the rationality test provided for in the current methodology, together with a wide discretion, statutory discretion that is provided to NERSA in terms of the NERSA Act as well as the Gas Act, provides ample means by which NERSA is in a position to manage the volatile situation that we are currently facing. And if one looks at the trajectory of the benchmark prices which make up the formula in the
I'm not sure if Mr. Maintjes is lost on my side only, colleagues, or I'm lost in that. Can you confirm?
Also on my side,
I
Chairperson.
can't hear him, Chair. Maybe if he can switch off his camera. Allow for.
Mr. Maintjes, we seem to have lost you, and The suggestion is that maybe you switch off your camera, but if those are around you.
There we go.
Lost you, Mr. Manchis, for a second there, so yeah.
Yes. No, apologies. Hopefully I'm back, and hopefully the network will be stable enough. So I'll just carry on from the point where the connection was lost, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, you may carry on, sir.
All right.
You have a minute, Mr. Manchis. I've allowed you a minute over them, so if you can conclude within a minute. I think we have lost him again. Mr. Mabunda, are you able to reset? Yeah. Mr. Manchis, I think we keep losing you, so I was saying that you just have a minute to conclude, so let's try and do that.
100%. Yes, as I said, as a result of the commodity nature of gas, combination of
Mr. Manchis, we are losing you, and I think in the interest of time, we have the slides that provide your conclusion. But if I may come back to you, Mr. Anderson, I see you on the screen. May I just come back to you? And I omitted to get you to just confirm your name for the record and your designation.
Sure, no problem. My name is Paul Anderson. I'm a partner at Genesis Analytics, which is an economic consultancy, and we've been assisting Sasol Gas in exploring appropriate pricing methodologies.
Mr. Manchis, thank you, Mr. Anderson. I'm not sure if you are back, Mr. Manchis. I just want you to put your name and designation at Sasol on the microphone for the record. We don't seem to be having Mr. Manchis back, so I'm going to request you, Mr. Anderson, that if you could take a pen and paper, you will take note of the questions that members of the panel may ask, and will respond after all of the panel members have asked the questions. May I then request the members of the panel, if they have any questions for clarity, to pose them to Mr. Anderson, who would record them for the rest of the Sasol team. I've got your hand, Advocate Sithole. Please go ahead.
I will start with my first two questions. Thank you for the opportunity, and also thanks to the Sasol team for the.
Ms. Advocate Sithole, you're not audible. If you could speak closer to your mic.
Okay. Am I audible?
You are not audible from my side.
Chair, can you hear me now?
Yes, you are clear. Mr. Anderson, are you able to hear Advocate Sithole?
I think so. Maybe.
Thank you.
I think I can.
Okay, Chair, if I'm not clear, please let me be given that indication. Chair, thank you, and thanks to the Sasol team for their presentation. I think my question is, I think it's directed to Mr. Anderson himself. The question is, if Sasol does not believe that the cost-based regulation, if it does not believe in that cost-based regulation in favor of the market-based pricing that has been contested in the country, have they considered an alternative such as an all-based indexation? A type of a regime or a hybrid thereof, And the second one is that what is Sasol's view on the adoption of the price cap in SA, as it has been recommended in other matured markets, where those markets have even failed in terms of that particular.
Advocate Zitolo, you are fading.
Chairperson, the second one is what is Sasol's view on the adoption of the price cap in SA, as it has been recommended in matured markets. And again, in those markets, this particular pricing regime has also failed. So I just want to get their views on those two. Chairperson, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Advocate Zitolo. I don't see your hand, Ms. Mpumbose, but I see there's a lingering hand here, so if you may go with your questions.
Thank you, Chairperson. Just to thank the Sasol team supported by Genesis, Genesis Analysis. If I can then just have, I've got actually just two questions. I think taking into account, the first one is taking into account that Sasol is involved at all levels of the market, that is wholesale, retail, and the consumer levels of the market. How do they then ensure that there's effective price differentiation, between the different users, traders, or importers, as anticipated in the Gas Act? And I've also had their point that, I think it was made by Mr. Anderson, that as well as Mr. Easterman, that the cost and work approach towards the cost plus methodology is the inappropriate way of regulating gas prices. In which industries or what studies have been found, that confirm that this might not work, for the gas industry? It could work for other regulated, industries, not necessarily the gas ones. And then also the next question is somehow linked to the first, as it relates to price differentiation. What I wanted to find out, doesn't the team from Sasol, obviously supported by Genesis as their consultants, think that the lack of price differentiation between the different segments of the market is a key barrier to entry, and thus will hamper the opening up of the market or the industry to healthy and effective competition, which is undesired? Because I think as the industry would like to have as many players in the market, just to make sure that it benefits contributes towards healthy competition and also benefits the users. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mpungose. Just one more question from my side. I think you have indicated that the cost base or cost plus methodology doesn't work because it does not promote investments and does not make you competitive with the international markets and the opportunity costs. There's a whole list of things. But may I just check with you that in the meantime, for now, we are not importing gas. We are not getting gas from the other places. In the meantime, wouldn't you think that regulating your pricing using the cost-based methodology would be sufficient? And yes, going forward with your future investments, when there are other things to compare it to, then maybe it would be time to consider it then. Let's take those as the first round of questions. Mr. Manchis, you have the floor. And Mr. Anderson, I think some questions were directed at you.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, while I was reconnecting, the first question that I heard was the question about the Sasol's opinion about the possible use and adoption of the price curve as a method to employ. I just wanted to verify whether there was a question prior to that one, which I may have missed while I was rejoining the call.
Mr. Manchis, there were questions before that, and Mr. Anderson been directed at him. Thank you.
Okay. Right. Price curve, and then on the price differentiation.
No, sure. I think that's no problem. In fact, I think there was only one quite close to the beginning.
Right.
And maybe I'm happy to start. And what I'm going to do is potentially kind of offer respond to a number of the questions that all kind of deal with the economic view of this, of why a cost-based type regulation, particularly a traditional cost plus WACC type regulation, doesn't work for gas. And I think of regulation makes sense for infrastructure industries. But I think what you glean from looking at some of the theory and the literature behind this, and just from, I think, empirical commodity like gas, it doesn't particularly work well. And I think there was a question. Part of the question around this was raised as to, can we point to the literature and to the kind of works where this is dealt with, and certainly I think I would like to just the one, I think, for me, and theoretical difficulties with this approach, particularly in terms of gas pricing, as well as some of the empirical outcomes that have happened. But I do also say there are other areas of the literature that we do point to, the alternatives to this. I think what's really, I think, part of the message in some of this literature, and particularly the work by the France School of Regulation, has been in light of the difficulties for gas. Actually, it can be quite sensible for regulators to start thinking and looking at alternatives to this, and they're in particular for these products. And I think, notwithstanding, I think certainly the extreme and unprecedented volatility in the market, I think, which has got not just NISA, but I think regulators around the world trying to figure out how to deal with this volatility. I think it still remains as a sound fundamental principle. And as Mr. Mankies has explained, the current methodology also does have scope to be able to deal with that volatility within that framework as it currently exists. Have we looked at other types in terms of kind of looking at an oil curve? I think that has been suggested as a type of methodology before and is raised. I don't have a particular view on that. I don't know if Sasol has a view on whether that could work or not. Certainly, in our minds, if what we're trying to do here is mimic a competitive outcome market, then actually using international benchmarks is helpful. And I do think kind of part of the message today was also just to highlight that we do think that the margin approach that NERSA has put on the table as part of this, the methodology that's proposing, is also quite a helpful tool, because what it does do is at least it takes the type of gross margin that traders earn in competitive environments, and that gives a fairly decent proxy for what is the right level of gross margin to be applied in this situation. So I think that's, so that would be my response, I think, to those types of questions, those types of aimed at me. I don't know if I've missed any out for myself, but maybe just to pause there and hand over to you then, JP.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think that the two questions that I will deal is the question about the price differentiation feeding into the market, and also the effect of a lack of price differentiation impacting on the entry into the market, as well as then your question, Mr. Chairman, about the utilization of a cost plus approach for a specific licensee as opposed to others. So I think on the price differentiation question, I think there's two parts of the question that one has to deal with. I think if one looks at the entry into the market by other importers or other suppliers of gas into the market, the price differentiation is not a particular mechanism that contributes or will contribute to the incentive of new investment or the development of sources of gas into the market. As we indicated earlier in the presentation, the price regulation that the regulator adopts is a very important signal and an important framework within which investment decisions by new entrants into the market is considered. The regulatory certainty and the stability within the price regulation environment is also a contributing factor that incentivizes the entry into the market. And as we've indicated, South Africa being an importer of gas is essentially a market that competes in the international gas supply environment for gas to be directed into our market, and therefore setting a differentiated approach to supply for different sources creates uncertainty and creates a scenario in which disincentivizes the entry into the market. When one looks in the market itself, traders necessitates an individual approach and an individual regulator, and as a result the regulator is in a position then to approve different maximum prices the is allowed for different traders are concerned. To the extent that there is an expectation or as well as future prices, obviously that principle will be taken on board and will be implemented as previously indicated. With regards to your question, Mr. Chairman, about the possibility of a approach being appropriate for a specific existing trader and at a future time or a price methodology be adopted, I think there's two important points to take cognizance of in that context. The fact of the matter is that one has to approach from the regulator's side the mandate of regulator we've put forward and the indications that we've made and the references to other jurisdictions with prices. That is the mandate that NERSA has, and to apply a cost plus approach to a specific trader would be to depart from that particular mandate, and therefore NERSA would, in our view, not be discharging the objective and the authority that it is provided regulatory framework as it stands. The other important factor that has to be taken into account indicated as a result of the lifespan and the particular point in time where we find ourselves in the lifespan of the current gas sources from which gas is imported by Sasol into the market, there is material and substantive capital investment that is required, and approaching the regulation of the price in a way that would not incentivize or confirm the economic viability of that continued investment impacts on the security of gas supply into the market. And we therefore strongly hold the view that on a principle basis, the appropriate way to determine the maximum prices and regulate the maximum prices by the regulator is to continue to comply with the mandate that the regulator has of mimicking competitive markets, and we retain the view that a cost plus approach, even for a single licensed trader in the market, will not achieve that mandate which rests on the shoulders of the regulator by virtue of the powers granted to it in terms of the empowering statute in terms of which the regulator exists. I think that if I go through the list that I've made, I think we've responded to all of the questions that have been presented in the first round, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Manches and Mr. Anderson. May I have additional questions and also check if, Walter, you have received an email with the questions that the panel may want to consider? Ms. Mbungose, are you fine? No additional questions?
Chairperson, I think my questions were not given an opportunity then to provide us. I think
you are fine.
Apologies, Chairperson. I was saying I do not believe my questions were answered in a satisfactory manner. And if there is an opportunity to give them to submit written submission, that will be appreciated, because from the response that I got, it seems as if the alternative that I've given a base indexation type of regime or hybrid was not really read properly. And if I understood Mr. Anderson, he said that that has not been, it was suggested, but it was not read to. And hence, I'm not satisfied with the response. And my additional question, which is a new one, Chair, that I need clarity on, it relates to that. And my question is that how does SASOL want to stop that? Okay.
Thank you, Advocate. Mr. Manches, the question that was asked, I think it was around the alternatives to the cost-based regulation and any other hybrids, and maybe give us examples. And the second one, if you could do that in writing, or if you are able to respond in a manner that is the one on the price cap in South Africa, and whether it's been recommended in other markets. And I think you've mentioned Mozambique, and how are you claiming that?
But I think what we will do is we will take, it is not a specific aspect that has been considered in preparation for the written response to that. With regards
Thank you, Mr. Manges. That would then be required within the next 7 days.
That's understood, Mr. Chairman. I think with the cost comes to bear on the consideration of again, there's maybe two important points to mention in that regard. In the submissions that we've made, as well as the presentation today, is a related entity, and SASOL then looks at the gas future third-party participant or entrant in the market has to consider the price that it would be able to achieve in the downstream market. That is a very important signal and an important factor which is taken into account when the overall economic feasibility of this capital is based on a methodology that achieves and determines the maximum price with to competitive markets. You end up in a situation that activity upstream from the trading activity is to be considered and will be available on an integrated basis within an integrated, vertically integrated organization like our own. So the price approach and the regulatory price approach that occur future capital investments of an existing importer and an existing participant in the market, just like that, just like is a determinant for the investment decisions by future Another important point also to bear in mind is that obviously the buy agreements that were concluded with the approval of the regulators and government entities in the Mozambican jurisdiction when these when the project was in between the upstream and the downstream entities within the integrated value chain. But the fact remains that the ultimate price that is achievable and the regulated price that the regulator puts in place in the downstream market does have a bearing on the capital decisions and the investment decisions of the vertically integrated organization of which the trading licensee forms a part, Mr. Chairman.
Chairperson, there are no additional comments or questions from my side, just to thank them for their presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Advocate Sithole, are you covered from your side?
Yes, perhaps. Thank you. You know, over and above the responses by the team to the various questions, if they've got any additional submissions that in support of the responses that they'd like to make, I'm sure those will be appreciated. Those to Walter. Thank you.
That have been made.
Yes, Mr. Bukula, I think the only concluding remark that I must make is as a result of the interruption of my connection, I think I didn't comply with your request for the record to just state my position. So I think just to, for completeness sake, it might be a good idea for me just to state that my name is JP Mankis and I work within the legal department of SASOL, and that's the capacity in which I am participating in the presentation. Mr. Chairman, I think with that, these make the oral submissions that we made today.
Thank you, Mr. Mankis, and may I also, Tim had mentioned, you may want to provide information that either counters that or support the process of, at some point, would allow for additional information so as to ensure that we make the right decision. As we can see from the questions, from the presentation, that the requirements that the regulator has to look at before making a decision are conflicting, is get the inputs from those who will be affected by it. This hearing is closed and